Welcome to North Yorkshire and to the Church of St Andrews in the village of Aldborough, which is about 15 miles to the northwest of York. We're here to help celebrate the Northern Aldborough Festival, a feast of classical music in this enchanting church and environment which attracts artists from all over the world. The church is built on the site of an old Roman forum, and in the 19th century they unearthed the statue of the god Mercury, which is today on show in the back of the church. Mercury, of course, was the fleet-footed, mercurial god of trade, travel and thieves, which takes me one way or another to our panel. David Davis, former Shadow Home Secretary, former member of the very fleet-footed SAS. He now campaigns against the securocrats on behalf of the ancient liberties of the citizen. On Desert Island Discs, one of his choices was a song called Stealing My Democracy. Salma Yaqub was one of the founders and now the leader of the Respect Party, which has a member of parliament in the personage of George Galloway. The party's name is an acronym for respect, equality, socialism, peace, environmentalism, community and trade unionism. It may safely be said that Douglas Murray's concept of respect does not embrace at least all of those qualities. As the Associate Director of the Henry Jackson Society, he is a strong believer in capitalism. Well, he gives it 2 cheers anyway. And the protection of liberal democracy around the world via the military strength of the Allied Western nations. His latest book is Bloody Sunday. It's a history of the Savile Inquiry. Alan Johnson held several cabinet posts in the New Labour years. Appointed Shadow Chancellor by Ed Miliband, he stood down last year from what he described as a, forgive the phrase, bloody depressing job. And he appears to be much happier as a result. True?
True. He said, gulping his water quickly.
Our panel.
So are the rest of us.
Our first question, please.
John Taylor. After such appalling atrocities, why did the United Nations, the West, Russia and China not intervene to help the Syrian people?
David Davis.
Well, sometimes you have to recognise there are things you can't do. The simple truth is to intervene in Syria would be bloodier and more unpleasant than the intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan put together. I mean, they estimate something like 100,000 people have died as a result of the Iraq war. I suspect the numbers will be worse for Syria. I mean, one of the problems, well, not one of the problems, the driving problem, I guess, in Syria today is the repressive minority led by Assad, mostly Alawite, part of the Alawite sect, and there are about 2 million of those. I suspect if Assad fell, a very large number of those people would die. So the 100,000 in Iraq may be a small number by comparison. So there are no easy answers. I'd love to be able to say to you, this is the solution, this is the way to do it, this is what we should do. This is one of those ones where I'm afraid civilized people have to just hold their breath and hope.
Douglas Murray.
Well, the last person to think that whatever would happen or whatever should happen in Syria could or would ever be simple. It's a very complex situation. I think that goes without saying. What's simple about it, what is straightforward, it comes back to the question on why the UN, particularly Russia and China you mentioned, will not do anything. I'm afraid that's very straightforward. The UN Security Council cannot work, does not work in a case like this. Every actor involved knows that it does not and cannot work. The UN Security Council will not come up with a resolution because Russia and China have no reason to have a resolution suggesting UN action in Syria because of their business interests there, because of their serious holdings within that area, and for many other issues of realpolitik for them. So when people say we must rely on the UN, they must be aware that the UN cannot solve this problem. The question then comes back to whether or not a country like this one can do anything. And I have to say that of the options before us, as I said, there are no simple ones. There are things we could think of doing, such as helping an international force to have a no-fly zone, stopping the use of helicopter gunships over areas that Assad's forces have been in. But none of it is straightforward. And I just add one other thing. I do wish, when discussing this, that our politicians, I'm not thinking of the ones on this panel, but that our politicians in this country were a bit more frank with the people about this. Because in recent days, both William Hague and David Cameron have decried, and rightly decried, the atrocities in Syria. But it's no good just continuing to decry them. You have to say what you would do. And the fact is, if we cannot as a country any longer be the sort of country that can express and defend our values, including innocent civilian life, including defending innocent civilian life, if we cannot cannot do that anymore, then I wish we'd just say so and not go through the pretense that we care about this and we'd like to do something, but perhaps the UN can do something, because that is simply a road to nothing.
Salma Yaqub.
Well, I shall answer Douglas Murray by saying, actually, the truth is our country is not in a position to militarily intervene. And even if it were, the military intervention would not actually help the situation. Of course, what is happening is terrible. There are massacres happening. People are dying. That is not in dispute. But whenever you talk about an intervention, surely the point of an intervention is to make something better, not worse. And if we were to either back or go in ourselves, which isn't an option, let's face it, we've already had overstretch from Iraq, we're struggling to get out of Afghanistan, it's not an option, and especially with the military cuts, 20%, we're going to see a reduction in the army. We know that militarily we're not going to actually do something, but we can still diplomatically. And I would support what is now being referred to as Annan Plus, as we need to see a renewed diplomatic effort. And yes, Russia and China should continue to be pressured to assert a stronger influence on Assad. We've seen an example with Yemen, where the people rose up, they were brutally put down, but through getting people round the table, all the players, people from the regime, as well as the opposition, as well as people within the region, actually an ordered transition took place. And that's what needs to take place in Syria. Assad has to go. He does not have the credibility both inside his country in terms of the opposition that has arisen. But yes, there are sections of the Syrian population which do support him, and they cannot be ignored. We talked about the difficulties. There's so many sects, 18 sects, and actually it's the Christians in Syria and the Alawites who are in the minority who feel most threatened should Assad fall. So there has to be some way where people feel protected in an orderly transition. And militarily intervening, it will actually make, I can tell you for a fact, as sure as we're all sitting in this church hall, the deaths won't reduce, they will actually increase. And that's why the military intervention should not be the favoured option, but diplomatic intervention must be reinforced.
Alan Johnson.
Well, the problem is, of course, those two countries that were mentioned, Russia and, to a certain extent, China. We can't get a UN resolution, but the UN have agreed to the Kofi Annan plan that Salma referred to. Indeed, the Arab League are the joint sponsors of Kofi Annan with the UN as an envoy to that country. And Kofi Annan's plan includes an immediate ceasefire, includes the withdrawal of troops, the release of political prisoners, the reopening of a political dialogue, and it's the only show in town. It's UN approved, it's approved by Russia, it's approved by China. And I sometimes despair when I see some of the coverage that, when the terrible events that have happened, 108 people killed last week, 98 people killed this week, and almost ridiculing Kofi Annan for making the attempt. It is still, I agree with William Hague on this, it is still the Annan six-point plan. It is the only show in town, and I think what has to happen now, as Kofi Annan said to the United Nations yesterday, is the UN, including Russia and China, have to put some teeth into the Annan plan, whether that's around sanctions or whether it's about other issues, so that it can be given a reasonable chance to succeed. And I don't think it has had that reasonable chance.
You haven't mentioned the fact that Kofi Annan wants Iran to be involved as part of the contact group, and the Western nations are saying not at all.
No, not yet. But hold on.
Where are you on that? Are you with the government on that?
Kofi Annan's six-point plan is very clear.
But
aside from that, he wants to create a contact group, which was very important, incidentally, in resolving other international crises.
Should the West swallow its dislike of Iran and say, if Kofi Annan is as wise as everyone says he is, Iran should be part of this?
I personally think it's very difficult to leave Iran out of this. They are a major player, and it's very difficult to ignore them. And if we want to have a contact group that leads to the implementation of the Annan plan, I don't think you can ignore Iran as part of that.
David Davis?
I agree. The simple truth is that you have to have every neighbouring nation involved. Whether you like it or not, where are the refugees going to flee to? How are you going to provide no-fly zones if you are going to do that? How are you going to provide sanctuary for the people who will otherwise be killed in genocides? The way to do it is involve every local nation, and that includes Iran.
But Iran is currently not only arming and sending troops to help the Assad regime, but is now boasting that it is doing so under the eyes of the UN, under the eyes of the international community. To involve Iran as if Iran can help this process is like asking an arsonist to come into a burning building.
But Douglas, isn't Saudi Arabia similarly arming the opposition? And should they therefore be excluded? Don't you start then excluding all the neighbouring countries?
You could do. I simply think that in the region, the destabilising force is and has been for more than 3 decades now Iran. And that Iran, which props up the Assad regime and has done for so many years as this proxy state, which itself is also a terror sponsor, if you roll this problem back in Syria, you can roll it back straight to Tehran. And I think that there is a justifiable excuse for saying we should at least look at Iran as part of the problem. That is not to say you ignore them, it's not to say nobody ever speaks to them, but to see them as necessarily part of the solution, I think, is to get some of this very wrong.
We will leave that there, thank you, and go to our next question.
David Taylor. Should the Home Secretary poke a stick into the lion's den and appoint a former rail regulator with a non-police background to the post of HM Inspector of Constabulary?
This is Tom Windsor, whom the government has said was head and shoulders above the other candidates. And that phrase, poke a stick in the lion's den, was, I think, David Blunkett's phrase. Alan Johnson.
I think it's provocative. I think it's inept. I don't agree with the Windsor Review, by the way. I am fundamentally against his incredible view that we should create an officer class in the police. He makes the point, actually, which I find rather offensive, coming from the working classes, that he recognises that the police have a core working class principle, but now they need people of high calibre, as if people of working class can't provide that high calibre. And the idea that you need an officer class when we're looking at breaking down social immobility in things like the judiciary and the army, I find incredible. But even if I thought everything that Tom Windsor said was correct, even if I thought his review was sensible and sound, which I don't, given the amount of antipathy it's caused amongst the police, to appoint him as the head of Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, I just cannot understand the sense of it. The police feel, at the moment, alienated from this government, and I predict that come the next election, one of the biggest political problems this government will face will be crime and disorder and this alienation of our police. When I was Home Secretary, I relied on HMIC to give me expert advice on policing. For instance, there's an issue about whether I should have asked HMIC to investigate the Metropolitan Police on the hacking inquiry on Murdoch in July 2009. If I had asked HMIC to do that, Dennis O'Connor, the current head, is a former police officer, as every head of HMIC has been since it was created in 1856, he would be able to talk to the Metropolitan Police as an experienced police officer. Windsor won't be able to do that. And anything Windsor does as the head of the HMIC, because he's going to be appointed, the government are going to get their man, anything he does now will be looked at with great suspicion by Britain's police force, who already feel alienated by this government.
From a former Home Secretary to a former shadow Home Secretary, David Davis.
Well, this is one of those few occasions tonight where we're going to disagree. Firstly, let's just deal with the working class thing. I mean, actually, Alan and I share a police force which has a brilliantly good Chief Constable in Tim Hollis, at Humberside, just south of here. So it's perfectly possible to get good Chief Constables up the route, as it were. But there is a problem with the management of the police today. The police, to a very large extent, have lost a lot of public confidence for different reasons, not all in their own control. There's a great deal of difficulty in terms of getting policemen onto the streets. I mean, we hear numbers like 15% of the police hours are spent on the beat rather than doing other things. Those of you who, on hacking, Alan mentioned hacking, those of you who watched the House of Commons Select Committee interrogating the heads of counter-terrorism who were in charge of hacking may not have been impressed by what you saw, and those are our best police officers in charge of